Okay, I think I'm live now. So I'm going to discuss this book a little bit. I'm not an expert in Immanuel Kant, and I'm doing this basically for my own edification and bringing you all along for the ride. But Immanuel Kant, in this book, which is sort of magnum opus, is credited with the Copernican revolution in philosophy. And what this means is that hitherto, all of Western philosophy has been preoccupied with the nature of reality or the thing in itself or absolute notions of being independent of the human mind, which the mind then has some kind of relation to and perceives or apprehends. And Kant is credited with the Copernican revolution in philosophy because he says that the categories of our understanding, of our rationality, such as even space and time and our ability to structure our sensory experiences into comprehensible information for the understanding, is sort of as far as we can get. So he's seeking to use reason to critique reason and the limits of reason. And he argues that we can't access the thing in itself in philosophy, in metaphysics. We can't access being itself or some kind of absolute without bringing the structures of our own mind and our rational faculties into the picture to organize the concepts coherently. And so there's sort of an agnosticism as to whether the thing in itself exists, because every way that we would have to understand it is already prefiguring the raw sense data that we would use to explore it, if that makes sense. So yeah, that's the critique of pure reason in a nutshell. And I will read a bit from the preface, which I just did when I thought I was live streaming, but we'll try again. Human reason has this peculiar fate that in one species of its knowledge it is burdened by questions which, as prescribed by the very nature of reason itself, it is not able to ignore, but which, as transcending all its powers, it is also not able to answer. So reason is burdened by questions prescribed by the nature of reason itself. Is there, because of the nature of reason itself, it is not able to ignore these questions. But because the questions transcend the powers of reason, it is not able to answer those questions. The perplexity into which it thus falls is not due to any fault of its own. It begins with principles which it has no option save to employ in the course of experience, and which this experience at the same time abundantly justifies it in using. Rising with their aid, since it is determined to this also by its own nature to ever higher, ever more remote conditions, it soon becomes aware that in this way, the questions never ceasing, its work must always remain incomplete, and it therefore finds itself compelled to resort to principles which overstep all possible empirical employment, and which yet seem so unobjectionable that even ordinary consciousness readily accepts them. So that would be like the way that the categories of space and time give coherence to our sense data that we perceive, even though we don't have an empirical basis for like justifying them that sort of stands outside of our experience. But by this procedure, human reason precipitates itself into darkness and contradictions, and while it may indeed conjecture that these must be in some way due to concealed errors, it is not in a position to be able to detect them. For since the principles of which it is making use transcend the limits of experience, they are no longer subject to any empirical tests. The battlefield of these endless controversies is called metaphysics. Time was when metaphysics was entitled the queen of all the sciences, and if the will be taken for the deed, the preeminent importance of her accepted tasks gives her every right to this title of honor. Now, however, the changed fashion of the time brings her only scorn. A matron outcast and forsaken, she mourns like Hecuba. Modi maxima vernam Tot generis natisque potens, nunc truhar exul inops. Beyond the powers of my Latin. Her government under the administration of the dogmatists was at first despotic, but inasmuch as the legislation still bore traces of the ancient barbarism, her empire gradually through intestine wars gave way to complete anarchy, and the skeptics, a species of nomads, despising all settled modes of life, broke up from time to time all civil society. Happily they were few in number, and were unable to prevent its being established ever anew, although on no uniform and self-consistent plan. In more recent times, it has seemed as if an end might be put to all these controversies, and the claims of metaphysics receive final judgment through a certain physiology of the human understanding, that of the celebrated Locke. But it has turned out quite otherwise, for however the attempt be made to cast doubt upon the pretensions of the supposed queen by tracing her lineage to vulgar origins and common experience, this genealogy has, as a matter of fact, been fictitiously invented, and she has still continued to uphold her claims. Metaphysics has accordingly lapsed back into the ancient time-worn dogmatism, and so again suffers that depreciation from which it was to have been rescued. And now, after all methods, so it is believed, have been tried and found wanting, the prevailing mood is that of weariness and complete indifferentism, the mother in all sciences of chaos and night, but happily in this case the source, or at least the prelude, of their approaching reform and restoration. For it at least puts an end to that ill-applied industry which has rendered them thus dark, confused, and unserviceable. But it is idle to feign indifference to such inquiries, the object of which can never be indifferent to our human nature. Indeed, these pretended indifferentists, however they might try to disguise themselves by substituting a popular tone for the language of the schools, inevitably fall back, insofar as they think at all, into those very metaphysical assertions which they profess so greatly to despise. Nonetheless, this indifference, showing itself in the midst of flourishing sciences and affecting precisely those sciences, the knowledge of which, if attainable, we should least of all care to dispense with, is a phenomenon that calls for attention and reflection. It is obviously the effect not of levity, but of the matured judgment of the age, which refuses to be any longer put off with illusory knowledge. It is a call to reason to undertake anew the most difficult of all its tasks, namely that of self-knowledge. Reason, here, let's just say, is seeking self-knowledge through using reason to understand reason and its limits, and to institute a tribunal which will assure to reason its lawful claims and dismiss all groundless pretensions, not by despotic decrees, but in accordance with its own eternal and unalterable laws. This tribunal is no other than the critique of pure reason. I do not mean by this critique of books and systems, but of the faculty of reason in general, in respect of all knowledge after which it may strive independently of all experience. So what can we know independently of what we perceive empirically? It will therefore decide as to the possibility or impossibility of metaphysics in general, because if you can't know anything apart from the raw sense data of experience, you can't really establish anything about being itself or the absolute nature of reality. It will therefore decide as to the possibility or impossibility of metaphysics in general, and determine its sources, its extent, and its limits, all in accordance with principles. I have entered upon this path, the only one that has remained unexplored, and flatter myself that in following it I have found a way of guarding against all those errors which have hitherto set reason, in its non-empirical employment, at variance with itself. I have not evaded its questions by pleading the insufficiency of human reason. On the contrary, I have specified these questions exhaustively according to principles, and after locating the point at which, through a misunderstanding, reason comes into conflict with itself, I have solved them to its complete satisfaction. The answer to these questions has not indeed been such as a dogmatic and visionary insistence upon knowledge might lead us to expect. That can be catered for only through magical devices in which I am not adept. Such ways of answering them are indeed not within the intention of the natural constitution of our reason, and inasmuch as they have their source in misunderstanding, it is the duty of philosophy to counteract their deceptive influence, no matter what prized and cherished dreams may have to be disowned. In this inquiry, I have made comprehensive Completeness, my chief aim, and I venture to assert that there is not a single metaphysical problem which has not been solved, or for the solution of which the key at least has not been supplied. Pure reason is indeed so perfect a unity that if its principle were insufficient for the solution of even a single one of all the questions to which it itself gives birth, we should have no alternative but to reject the principle, since we should then no longer be able to place implicit reliance upon it in dealing with any one of the other questions. While I am saying this, I can fancy that I detect in the face of the reader an expression of indignation, mingled with contempt, at the pretensions seemingly so arrogant and vainglorious. Yet they are incomparably more moderate than the claims of all those writers who, on the lines of the usual program, profess to prove the simple nature of the soul or the necessity of a first beginning of the world. For while such writers pledge themselves to extend human knowledge beyond all limits of possible experience, I humbly confess that this is entirely beyond my power. I have to deal with nothing save reason itself and its pure thinking, and to obtain complete knowledge of these there is no need to go far afield, since I come upon them in my own self. Common logic itself supplies an example, how all the simple acts of reason can be enumerated completely and systematically. The subject of the present inquiry is the question, how much can we hope to achieve by reason when all of the material and assistance of experience are taken away? So much as regards completeness in our determination of each question and exhaustiveness in our determination of all the questions with which we have to deal. These questions are not arbitrarily selected. They are prescribed to us by the very nature of knowledge itself as being the subject matter of our critical inquiry. As regards the form of our inquiry, certainty and clearness are two essential requirements, rightly to be exacted from anyone who ventures upon so delicate an undertaking. As to certainty, I have prescribed to myself the maxim that in this kind of investigation it is in no wise permissible to hold opinions. Everything, therefore, which bears any manner of resemblance to a hypothesis is to be treated as contraband. It is not to be put up for sale even at the lowest price, but forthwith confiscated immediately upon detection. Any knowledge that professes to hold a priori lays claim to be regarded as absolutely necessary. This applies still more to any determination of all pure a priori knowledge, since such determination has to serve as the measure, and therefore as the supreme example, of all apodictic philosophical certainty. Whether I have succeeded in what I have undertaken must be left altogether to the reader's judgment. The author's task is solely to adduce grounds, not to speak as to the effect which they should have upon those who are sitting in judgment. But the author, in order that he may not himself innocently be the cause of any weakening of his arguments, may be permitted to draw attention to certain passages, which, although they merely incidental, may yet occasion some mistrust. Such timely intervention may serve to counteract the influence which even quite undefined doubts as to these minor matters might otherwise exercise upon the reader's attitude in regard to the main issue. I know no inquiries which are more important for exploring the faculty which we entitle understanding and for determining the rules and limits of its employment than those which I have instituted in the second chapter of the Transcendental Analytic under the title Deduction of the Pure Concepts of Understanding. They are also those which have cost me the greatest labor, as I hope, not unrewarded. This inquiry, which is somewhat deeply grounded, has two sides. The one refers to the objects of pure understanding and is intended to expound and render intelligible the objective validity of its a priori concepts. It is therefore essential to my purposes. The other seeks to investigate the pure understanding itself, its possibility, and the cognitive faculties upon which it rests, and so deals with it in its subjective aspect. Although this latter exposition is of great importance for my chief purpose, it does not form an essential part of it, for the chief question is always simply this: what and how much can the understanding and reason know apart from all experience? Not how is the faculty of thought itself possible? The latter is, as it were, the search for the cause of a given effect, and to that extent is somewhat hypothetical in character, though, as I shall show elsewhere, it is not really so, and I would appear to be taking the liberty simply of expressing an opinion, in which case the reader would be free to express a different opinion. For this reason, I must forestall the reader's criticism by pointing out that the objective deduction with which I am here chiefly concerned retains its full force, even if my subjective deduction should fail to produce that complete conviction for which I hope. On this matter, what has been said on page 92 to 93 should in any case suffice by itself. So he then goes on to talk about why he doesn't use examples and illustrations. He says, it can be said of many a book that it would be much shorter if it were not so short. On the other hand, if we have in view the comprehensibility of a whole of speculative knowledge, which though wide-ranging has the coherence that follows from unity of principle, we can say with equal justice that many a book would have been much clearer if it had not made such an effort to be clear. For the aids to clearness, though they may be of assistance in regard to details, often interfere with our grasp of the whole. The reader is not allowed to arrive sufficiently quickly at a conspectus of the whole. The bright coloring of the illustrative material intervenes to cover over and conceal the articulation and organization of the system, which, if we are able to judge of its unity and solidity, are what chiefly concern us. The reader, I should judge, will feel it to be no small inducement to yield his willing cooperation, when the author is thus endeavoring, according to the plan he had proposed, to carry through a large and important work in a complete and lasting manner. Metaphysics, on the view which we are adopting, is the only one of all the sciences which dare promise that through a small but concentrated effort it will attain, and this in a short time, such completion as will leave no task to our successors, save that of adapting it in a didactic manner according to their own preferences, without their being able to add anything whatsoever to its content. For it is nothing but and there's always this sort of eschatological, grand unifying theory impulse in philosophers where he's saying what he's doing in metaphysics will leave no real philosophical project to his heirs except for how to arrange the ideas in explaining them and teaching them. For it is nothing but the inventory of all our possessions through pure reason systematically arranged. In this field nothing can escape us. What reason produces entirely out of itself cannot be concealed, but is brought to light by reason itself immediately. The common principle has been discovered. The complete unity of this kind of knowledge and the fact that it is derived solely from pure concepts, entirely uninfluenced by any experience or by special intuition, such as might lead to any determinate experience that would enlarge and increase it, make this unconditioned completeness not only practicable but also necessary. Tecum habita et noris quam sit tibi quarta sapellex. Such a system of pure speculative reason I hope myself to produce under the title Metaphysics of Nature. It will be not half as large yet incomparably richer in content than the present critique, which has as its first task to discover the sources and conditions of the possibility of such criticism, clearing, as it were, and leveling what has hitherto been waste ground. In this present enterprise, I look to my reader for the patience and impartiality of a judge, whereas in the other I shall look for the benevolent assistance of a fellow worker. For however completely all the principles of the system are presented in this critique, the completeness of the system itself likewise requires that none of the derivative concepts be lacking. These cannot be enumerated by any a priori computation, but must be discovered gradually. Whereas, therefore, in this critique the entire synthesis of the concepts has been exhausted, there will still remain the further work of making their analysis similarly complete, a task which is rather an amusement than a labor. And then he just mentions some typographical niceties, which are important because, compared to somebody like Hegel, I feel like Kant is very systematic and methodical in a way that makes intuitive sense, even though it's very dense and technical. If you put the effort into reading it, it's still comprehensible. My opinion is, there are moments in Hegel of insight to be gleaned, like the master-slave dialectic, what that says about the development of human consciousness from the first-person perspective and all of that, but Hegel kind of loses me with the absolute spirit and the progression of culmination of history and all of that, whereas Kant I find to be very convincing. Nietzsche also has some problems with Kant, but we can discuss that tomorrow, maybe as a preface to on the uses and disadvantages of history for life reading from Nietzsche that I'll be doing tomorrow. And that's pretty much all I have to say. I'm going to read experimentally something from ChatGPT that might help you and might not. I don't endorse using artificial intelligence to think philosophy for you, but I do think that it can be used as a tool. So I wrote, write a summary of the critique of pure reason suitable for a live stream on Instagram or YouTube, designed to induce clients to call me on Night Flirt, include direct quotations from the text. Yep, no pants. Tonight I want to discuss one of the most influential and destabilizing books ever written, Immanuel Kant's Critique of Pure Reason. And what makes Kant so dangerous and so intoxicating is that he essentially asks a forbidden question. What if reality as we experience it is partially constructed by the mind itself? Before Kant, philosophers tended to divide into two camps. The rationalists believed truth comes primarily from reason. The empiricists believed all knowledge comes from sensory experience. Kant enters this war and says both are incomplete. According to Kant, the mind is not a passive receiver of reality. The mind actively structures experience itself. Space, time, and causality, these are not merely out there in the world. They are forms through which consciousness organizes reality. This is why Kant famously writes, thoughts without content are empty, intuitions without concepts are blind. In other words, sensation alone gives us chaos. Pure reason alone gives us abstraction. Human knowledge emerges from the synthesis of both. One of Kant's most revolutionary claims is the distinction between the phenomenal world and the noumenal world. The phenomenal world is reality as it appears to us, the world filtered through the structures of human cognition. The noumenal world, or the thing in itself, exists beyond the limits of what we can directly know. And this is where the book becomes almost existentially intense. Kant argues there are limits built into human understanding itself. The mind reaches toward infinity, God, freedom, or the soul, but cannot fully grasp them through pure reason alone. He writes, I had therefore found it necessary to deny knowledge in order to make room for faith. Not faith in a simplistic sense, but recognition that reason itself encounters boundaries. Kant completely changes the role of philosophy. Philosophy is no longer merely about describing reality. It becomes an investigation into the conditions that make experience possible for the human mind. Why do humans perceive causality? Why do we experience time linearly? Why does consciousness organize the world as it does? Kant turns philosophy inward, and that's the Copernican revolution. And without Kant, you do not get Hegel, Nietzsche, Heidegger, phenomenology, psychoanalysis, or even large portions of modern critical theory. And perhaps the most unsettling aspect of the Critique of Pure Reason is this. The world you experience may not simply be reality itself. It may be reality as filtered through the exquisite limitations of the human mind. So that was ChatGPT's contribution and commentary. And while we're in this sort of enlightenment territory, I'll also add a little bit of Foucault. Let me go grab the book. In this text, Foucault has the essay, his response to Kant's What is Enlightenment, which is very important. What is critique? What is revolution? I don't know. For an ethics of discomfort. Is the Enlightenment essay? Enlightenment today. What is enlightenment? Kant asked himself in a short essay in a Berlin newspaper in 1784, a few years before the revolution in France would sweep Europe, inspiring his Republican enthusiasm. Reprinted, it starts this volume. Enlightenment is man's release from his self-incurred tutelage. Tutelage is man's inability to make use of his understanding without direction from another. Self-incurred is this tutelage when its cause lies not in lack of reason, but in lack of resolution and courage to use it without direction from another. Sapere aude, have courage to use your own reason. That is the norm of enlightenment. Laziness and cowardice are the reasons why so great a portion of mankind, after nature has long since discharged them from external direction, naturalier majorinus, nevertheless remains under lifelong tutelage, and why it is so easy for others to set themselves up as their guardians. So basically, people don't want to think for themselves. It is so easy not to be of age. If I have a book which understands for me, a pastor who has a conscience for me, a physician who decides my diet, and so forth, I need not trouble myself. I need not think. If I can only pay, others will readily undertake the irksome work for me. That the step to competence is held to be very dangerous by the far greater portions of mankind, and by the entire fair sex, quite apart from its being arduous, is seen by those guardians who have so kindly assumed superintendence over them. After the guardians have first made their domestic cattle dumb and have made sure that these placid creatures will not dare take a single step without the bare harness of the cart to which they are tethered, the guardians then show them the danger which threatens if they try to go alone. Actually, however, this danger is not so great, for by failing a few times, they would finally learn to walk alone. But an example of this failure makes them timid and ordinarily frightens them away from all further trials. For any single individual to work himself out of the life under tutelage which has become almost his nature is very difficult. He has come to be fond of this state, and he is for the present really incapable of making use of his reason, for no one has ever let him try it out. Statutes and formulas, those mechanical tools of the rational employment, or rather misemployment of his natural gifts, are the fetters of an everlasting tutelage. Whoever throws them off makes only an uncertain leap over the narrowest ditch, because he is not accustomed to that kind of free notion. Therefore, there are few who have succeeded by their own exercise of mind, both in freeing themselves from incompetence and in achieving a steady pace. But that the public should enlighten itself is more possible, indeed, if only freedom is granted. Enlightenment is almost sure to follow. For there will always be some independent thinkers, even among the established guardians of the great masses, who, after throwing off the yoke of tutelage from their own shoulders, will disseminate the spirit of the rational appreciation of both their own worth and every man's vocation for thinking for himself. But be it noted that the public, which has first been brought under this yoke by their guardians, forces the guardians themselves to remain bound when it is incited to do so by some of the guardians who are themselves capable of some enlightenment. So harmful is it to implant prejudices, for they later take vengeance on their cultivators or on their descendants. Thus the public can only slowly attain enlightenment. Perhaps a fall of personal despotism or of avariciousness or tyrannical oppression may be accomplished by revolution, but never a true reform in the ways of thinking. Rather, new prejudices will serve as well as old ones to harness the great unthinking mass. For this enlightenment, however, nothing is required but freedom, and indeed the most harmless among all the things to which this term can be properly applied. It is the freedom to make public use of one's reason at every point. But here on all sides, do not argue, the officer says. Do not argue, but drill, the tax collector. Do not argue, but pay, the cleric. Do not argue, but believe. Only one prince in the world says, argue as much as you will, and about what you will, but obey. Everywhere there is restriction on freedom. Which restriction is an obstacle to enlightenment, and which is not an obstacle but a promoter of it, I answer. The public use of one's reason must always be free, and it alone can bring about enlightenment among men. The private use of reason, on the other hand, may often be narrowly restricted without particularly hindering the progress of enlightenment. By the public use of one's reason, I understand the use which a person makes of it as a scholar before the reading public. Private use, I call that which one may make of it in a particular civil post or office which is entrusted to him. Many affairs which are conducted in the interest of the community require a certain mechanism through which some members of the community must passively conduct themselves with an artificial unanimity, so that the government may direct them to public ends, or at least prevent them from destroying those ends. Here, argument is certainly not allowed. One must obey. But so far as a part of the mechanism regards himself at the same time as a member of the whole community or of society of world citizens, and thus in the role of a scholar who addresses the public in the proper sense of the world through his writings, he certainly can argue without hurting the affairs for which he is in part responsible as a passive member. Thus it would be ruinous for an officer in service to debate about the suitability or utility of a command given to him by his superior. He must obey. But the right to make remarks on errors in the military services and to lay them before the public cannot be equitably refused him as a scholar. The citizen cannot refuse to pay the taxes imposed on him. Indeed, an impudent complaint at those levied on him can be punished as a scandal, as it could occasion the general refractories. But the same person nevertheless does not act contrary to his duty as a citizen when, as a scholar, he publicly expresses his thoughts on the inappropriateness or even the injustice of those levies. Similarly, a clergyman is obligated to make his sermon to his public in catechism and his congregation conform to the symbol of the church which he serves, for he has been accepted on this condition. But as a scholar, he has complete freedom, even the calling, to communicate to the public all his carefully tested and well-meaning thoughts on that which is erroneous in the symbol, to make suggestions for the better organization of the religious body and church. In doing this, there is nothing that could be laid out as a burden on his conscience. For what he teaches as a consequence of his office as a representative of the church, this he considers something about which he has no freedom to teach according to his own lights. It is something which he is appointed to propound at the dictation of and in the name of another. He will say, our church reaches this or that. Those are the proofs which it adduces. He thus extracts all practical uses for his congregation from statutes to which he himself would not subscribe with full conviction, but to the enunciation of which he can very well pledge himself, because it is not impossible that truth lies hidden in them, and in any case there is at least nothing in them contradictory to inner religion. For if he believed he had found such in them, he could not conscientiously discharge the duties of his office, he would have to give it up. The use, therefore, which an appointed teacher makes of his reason before his congregation is merely private, because his congregation is only a domestic one, even if it be a large gathering. With respect to it, as a priest, he is not free, nor can he be free, because he carries out the orders of another. But as a scholar whose writings speak to the public, the world, the clergyman in the public use of his reason enjoys an unlimited freedom to make use of his own reason and to speak in his own person. That the guardian of the people in spiritual things should themselves be incompetent is an absurdity which amounts to the eternalization of absurdities. But would not a society of clergymen, perhaps a church conference or a venerable classis, as they call themselves among the Dutch, be justified in obligating itself by oath to a certain unchangeable symbol in order to enjoy an unceasing guardianship over each of its members and thereby over the people as a whole, and even to make it eternal? I answer that this is altogether impossible. Such a contract, made to shut off all the further enlightenment from the human race, is absolutely null and void, even if confirmed by the supreme power, by parliaments, and by the most ceremonious of peace treaties. An age cannot bind itself and ordain to put the succeeding one to such condition that it cannot extend its at the best very occasional knowledge, purify itself of errors, and progress in general enlightenment. That would be a crime against human nature, the proper destination of which lies precisely in this progress, and the descendants would be fully justified in rejecting those decrees as having been made in an unwarranted and malicious manner. The touchstone of everything that can be concluded as a law for a people lies in the question whether the people could have imposed such a law on itself. Now, such religious compact might be possible for a short and definitively limited time, as it were in the expectation of a better, One might let every citizen, and especially the clergyman in the role of a scholar, make his comments freely and publicly through writing on the erroneous aspects of the present institution. The newly introduced order might last until insight into the nature of the things had become so general and widely approved that through uniting their voices, even if not unanimously, they could bring a proposal to the throne to take those congregations under protection, which had united them into a changed religious organization according to their better ideas, without, however, hindering others who wish to remain in the order. But to unite in a permanent religious institution, which is not to be subject to doubt before the public, even in the lifetime of one man, and thereby to make a period of time fruitless in the progress of mankind towards improvement, thus working to the disadvantage of posterity, that is absolutely forbidden. For himself, and only for a short time, a man may postpone enlightenment in what he ought to know, but to renounce it for himself and evermore to renounce it for posterity, and trample on the rights of mankind. And what a people may not decree for itself can even less be decreed for them by a monarch, for his law-giving authority rests on his uniting the general public will in his own. If he only sees to it that all true or alleged improvement stands together with civil order, he can leave it to his subjects to do what they find necessary for their spiritual welfare. This is not to prevent one of them from violently hindering another in determining and promoting this welfare to the best of his ability. To meddle in these matters lowers his own majesty, since by writings in which his subjects seek to present their views, he may evaluate his own governance. He can do this when, with deepest understanding, he lays upon himself the reproach, Caesar non est supra grammaticos. Far more does he injure his own majesty when he degrades his supreme power by supporting the ecclesiastical despotism of some tyrants in his state over his other subjects. If we are asked, do we now live in an enlightened age, the answer is no, but we do live in an age of enlightenment. As things now stand, much is lacking which prevents men from being or easily becoming capable of correctly using their own reason in religious matters with assurance and free from outside direction. But on the other hand, we have clear indication that the field has now been opened wherein men may freely deal with these things, and that the obstacles to general enlightenment or the release from self-imposed tutelage are gradually being reduced. In this respect, this is the age of enlightenment, or the century of Frederick. A prince who does not find it unworthy of himself to say that he holds it to be his duty to prescribe nothing to men in religious matters, but to give them complete freedom while renouncing the haughty name of tolerance, is himself enlightened and deserves to be esteemed by the grateful world and posterity as the first, at least from the side of government, who divested the human race of its tutelage and left each man free to make use of his own reason in matters of conscience. Under him, venerable ecclesiastics are allowed, in the role of scholars, and without infringing on their official duties, freely to submit for public, resting their judgments and views, which here and there diverge from the established symbol. And even greater freedom is enjoyed by those who are restricted by no official duties. This spirit of freedom spreads beyond this land, even to those in which it must struggle with external obstacles erected by a government which misunderstands its own interest. For an example gives evidence to such a government that in freedom there is not the least cause for concern about public peace and the stability of the community. Men work themselves gradually out of barbarity, if only intentional artifices are not made to hold them in it. I have placed the main point of enlightenment, the escape of men from their self-incurred tutelage, chiefly in matters of religion, because our rulers have an interest in playing the guardian with respect to the arts and sciences, and also because religious incompetence is not only the most harmful, but also the most degrading of all. But the manner of thinking of the head of a state who favors religious enlightenment goes further, and he sees that there is no danger to his law-giving in allowing his subjects to make public use of their reason and to publish their thoughts on better formulation of his legislation, and even their open-minded criticisms of the laws already made. Of this we have a shining example, wherein no monarch is superior to him whom we honor. But only one who is himself enlightened is not afraid of shadows, and has a numerous and well-disciplined army to assure public peace, can say, argue as much as you will, and about what you will, only obey. A republic could not dare say such a thing. Here is shown a strange and unexpected trend in human affairs in which almost everything looked at in the large is paradoxical. A greater degree of civil freedom appears advantageous to the freedom of mind of the people, and yet it places inescapable limitations upon it. A lower degree of civil freedom, on the contrary, provides the mind with room for each man to extend himself to his full capacity. As nature has uncovered from under this hard shell the seed for which she most tenderly cares, the propensity and vocation for free thinking, this gradually works back upon the character of the people, who thereby gradually become capable of managing freedom. Finally, it affects the principles of government, which finds it to its advantage to treat men, who are now more than machines, in accordance with their dignity. So that was What is Enlightenment? A famous essay by Immanuel Kant, and he's advocating for the public use of reason as being advantageous to progress. I'll just conclude with an excerpt from Foucault. Never consent to be completely comfortable with your own certainties. Never let them sleep, but never believe that a new fact will be enough to reverse them. Never imagine that one can change them like arbitrary axioms. Remember that in order to give them an indispensable nobility, one must see far, but also close up and right around oneself. One must clearly feel that everything perceived is only evident when surrounded by a familiar and poorly known horizon, that each certitude is only sure because of the support offered by unexplored ground. The most fragile instant has roots. There is here a whole ethics of tireless evidence that does not exclude a rigorous economy of the true and the false, but is not reduced to it either. So that's good. I'm pretty much done with my reading. I feel like I've articulated something there. We went through the Critique of Pure Reason preface and explained that the goal is to use reason, to understand reason, to critique the notion of being itself and understand how reason imposes categories on our experience. Then we read What is Enlightenment, which is about intellectual freedom. And we concluded with Foucault's Ethics of Discomfort. So thank you for watching this, and I am sorry I haven't read any comments if there are any, if anyone's watching at all. But tomorrow I'll be doing a reading that I am more competent to actually articulate, which is a chapter from Nietzsche's Untimely Meditations called On the Uses and Disadvantages of History for Life, and that will be at 9 p.m. Eastern. Thank you.